Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I hope you managed to have a lovely lunch. It was really, really delicious, so including the dessert. So I hope that we are being to be able to start now. I always hate those spots in my eyes, but we'll make do with it. Today we are very happy to be together in this conversation on looking at material demand and solutions for the energy transition. I'm going to be inviting our distinguished panelists to the front, and please join us on the day. Janez Potočnik, who is the co-chair of the International Resource Panel. Welcome. Thank you, Janez. Janez is going to actually be setting the scene for us today. Janez, as co-chair of the International Resource Panel, has been one of the lead thinkers behind the Global Resource Outlook 2024, which actually looks at material use and the need to enhance sustainability. And Janez will actually take us mentally into the space where we need to be for our panelists to then join us to take the amazing conversation forward. Over to you, Janez.
Thank you. So, good day, everybody, again. This time I will hold the clicker myself. Anyway, you will hear some of the repetition from what you have heard in the speech, but some of the repetition is sometimes good. So let me start the story with some of the things which have already been heard about climate change facts. So global CO2 emissions, highest 2023 ever. Global surface temperature increase above pre-industrial level. It's practically on the limit which we have set to ourselves. And fossil fuel subsidies topping 7 trillion, which is 7.1% of GDP. Annual economic losses due to climate change, due to extreme weather events are increasing, and it's impossible to hide that. By the way, my own country, Slovenia, last summer was total disaster. And all the above are the highest in the history of the last recorded year. But this is in particularly interesting. I picked it up very recently. What are we teaching at our universities? Norwegian Institute of International Affairs actually reviewed 18,400 universities in practically all UN countries, and they found that 68% of the world's energy education degrees are focused on fossil fuels still today, and only 32 on renewable energy, which means that we are still pretty much locked in the fossil story, even when it comes to education, when we are educating the new generations to deal with those questions. We are surpassing already 6 of the planetary boundaries. We know that climate change is one, but only one of them. And when we look to the questions, we normally look through the optic of energy, which is the most important. But climate breakdown, it's a symptom of ecological overshoot. Material footprint, it's normally dangerously under-discussed, and of course the overshoot highlights the material usage, waste output, and growth of human society. So it's bringing another optic. So what I have already said before, but let me repeat it. So supply-side solutions, which are about carbon management and focusing on energy, which are currently prevailing solutions, need to be coupled with demand-side solutions, so everything which is linked to decoupling and circular economy, and they should be coupled with nature-based solutions, which is ecosystem services and environmental things. By the way, this green and blue part are slowly coming into, in COP28, they were first time seriously mentioned, but it was COP28, it was not COP1, unfortunately. So the real challenge is decarbonization and decoupling, how you marry them and how they would go together, which leads me to the global resource outlook. And as mentioned, economy championed by industrialized nations is wasteful and unjust, so we must shift away from the prevailing resource wasteful economic approach. So we do acknowledge the importance of GDP, don't be clearly, but we think that simply we need to be guided by the well-being, because the current situation and current logic is both ethically and ecologically unsustainable. So major novelty is setting the order right. Economy was invented to serve humans and not the opposite, so we are looking to optimize provisioning systems, human needs, and we are guided by the well-being. So when we talk about materials and resources, we talk about biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and non-metallic minerals. We call all that together materials, so everything extracted from Earth are materials. And majority of our analysis, frankly, is based on materials, and to a lesser extent also land and water. And if we add land and water, then we talk about resources. So if we look to the impacts, extraction and processing of natural resources are causing 60% of global climate change impacts, including land use change, 40% of air pollution health impacts, and 90% of water stress, and also biodiversity loss linked to land and water eutrophication. So when we were looking then to the trends through the provisioning needs, which is a new optic which we have introduced, we have actually identified that 4 major provisioning systems: built environment, mobility, food, and energy, are approximately 90% of all material use. But let us look in the country income groups. Low-income country, majority of materials which we take from the earth is used for meeting the food needs. In low-middle income countries, it's food plus shelter. In upper middle income countries, majority is for shelter and mobility, and in our high income countries, it's pretty much equally distributed between all provisioning systems. It's nicely showing you the whole development path and what is more important for humans in the first. So first you need to eat, then you need to have a shelter, then you ask yourself about mobility, and that's how practically the whole development story goes. If we look it through the provisioning system, which is again another kind of impact looking, then we can find out that in climate impacts, practically all provisioning systems are equally contributing their 20% to that. That when we look to the health impacts, that could be majority linked to the household fuel use, heating, energy, and private mobility, and majority of water stress, biodiversity loss, it's connected with, of course, food system. So if we look then to the trends, last 50 years, approximately 3.5 times increase. And if we look to the structure, so all are in absolute terms increasing. But if you look to the structure, you find out that the major increase is basically non-metallic minerals, which is logical, because this is the material which we use for infrastructure, which we use for building cities, and this is because of those parts of the world where we have the huge number of population are developing relatively fast. But also if we look to the metals, even the metals in relative terms were increasing from 9.8 to 10%, which is currently the share. So this leads me now to the story which is basically pretty much in the center of our attention today. So according to International Energy Agency, on the supply side, reaching net zero by 2050 requires about 6 times today critical mineral use in 2040. And in the demand side, where most typically it's electric vehicles, they use close to 10 times the material of conventional cars. So if we look then to the supply of various kind of materials, cobalt, graphite, nickel, nicodium, copper, lithium, the conclusion there is relatively simple. Even with the most ambitious mining expansions, future demand for some of them will exceed the supply in short and mid-term. So we need to have that in mind. And when we look to environmental and social impacts, we normally look to environmental and social impacts only in the mining phase, yeah? So extraction, but they have also the impacts in the processing, they have the impacts in manufacturing, they have the impacts in the use, and they have the impacts in disposal and waste. So you need to look in the whole value chain, what are the impacts of those additional materials which you actually introduce. So what are the indispensable pillars of material resilience? So this is based on a co-chair piece which was developed by IRP, by Isabella Teixeira and myself, and it's very much trying to say where our optic should be based on what is the IRP story behind. So absolutely necessary is for any new transition materials with, there we need to take care for the highest environmental and social standards. So securing enough supply, ensuring supply is sufficient to power the energy transition, aligning expanded supply with sustainable development, improving supply resilience by improving transition materials, geographic diversification. That's pretty much in the attention already today of all policymakers. They more or less speak about that. And when they speak about circularity, they speak about recycling. So capturing future secondary transitional materials. But I will touch a bit more later what is the problem there. What is currently missing in the circularity even field is more intensive use, lightweightening, lifetime extension. So circularity should be looked also when we talk about transitional materials, about critical raw materials in much more sophisticated and complex way. But what is the problem of that? When we talk about critical raw materials, we basically talk about those who are essential for energy. This is part of definition of those who are essential to key energy transition, but also those who are projected to see significant growth in demand or likely experience supply-demand gaps. So if you then use only recycling as a kind of way out, you have to be aware of a simple fact. Recycling is a solution when you have stable needs. So because it's actually but when you have high growing needs, you see then the recycling, it's not a solution. So what are the batteries today if in 10 years you will need 10 times more of that? If you recycle all the batteries today, you still have 10% in 10 years. So that's not a solution. So what we basically advocate in IRP is, of course, decoupling. And when we talk about decoupling, we basically talk about that to those things which are currently part of policy making and attention, we need to add that which is the broader part of circular economy solutions, but even more important is to add that we should in the first place try to find out how to meet those systems like mobility and buildings which use a lot of those materials. How can we provide, and which use a lot of energy, how can we provide them in more energy efficient way, which means also in more material efficient way. So the whole story, according to us, would need to be set up upside down like it is currently set. So first of all, optimize delivery of human needs and energy material intensive systems, then activate all policies which encourage all circularity levers, and finally supply the still needed transition materials with highest environmental and social standards. So that would set simply the logic and the order right. Which leads me to that, is there a potential behind? Yes, we have done a serious modeling in the GROW24 where we have modeled these societal transformations in mobility and shelter, in energy and food, and we added also the just transition part of the modeling. And if you look to the effects, then we have found out that yes, it's possible. We can mitigate growth in material use by 30% by 2060 compared to continued with historical trends, and we can reduce energy demand by 25% by 2060. So that's possible. And even more, if I would go a bit more deeper, I would tell you that even economic growth in this is higher than actually in the business as usual scenario. So all that is possible. And this is not the only thing which we were working on in the IRP. We have a few years ago also published a report which talks about mineral resource governance, which is today a really problematic issue, and we are proposing the Sustainable Development License to operate, and we are currently working on the report, Financing the Supply of Minerals and Metals for Sustainable Development, which lead author is my dear friend Paul sitting and will be later part of the panel, and I'm pretty sure you will talk more of that, what can the audience expect from the work which we are doing there. So, before ending and making one slide of conclusions, one thing which also drew my attention recently is this fact that AI, which is coming very quickly, might somehow change the assumption that energy needs of a growing population might be offset by improving energy efficiency. Why? Because their energy needs are enormous. So there it's, for example, Constellation Energy estimates that AI revolution could require more power in US than the future electrification of all vehicle fleet. So that's how serious the things are. So bottom line, the rise of AI could make the journey to electrification longer, harder, and more costly. So in short, to conclude, energy transition from fossil to renewable energy, it's a must. Energy transition requires increased demand for materials on supply as well as on demand side. Additional transition materials should be supplied respecting the highest environmental and social standards and limiting by activating policies which encourage all circularity levers and optimizing delivery of human needs in energy and material-intensive systems. Decoupling well-being and economic activity from resource use is essential for living well and thriving within planetary boundaries. Thus, these materials needed for energy transition must be secured respecting the overall decoupling logic. And finally, we need to create consistency among addressing climate and other environmental and social targets and challenges, and this would make also the energy transition easier and feasible. We could avoid some of the difficult questions, like deep sea mining, do we need it or not? Or some questions which are also linked to the energy transition, which are also quite delicate. And in particular, when taking into account also the foreseen trends in the AI sector. So, main growth 24 recommendation is simple. The question we should ask first is not how to secure and diversify the supply of additionally needed critical raw materials, even if this is an important question to ask, but rather how to limit their needs by recognizing our most resource-intensive, by reorganizing our most resource-intensive human needs, providing them in most resource-efficient way, respecting planetary boundaries. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janez, for having taken us through this, framing our thinking around what the challenges are at the moment, where we are heading, and what we absolutely need to think in terms of transforming that journey. So let me now invite our distinguished panelists to the stage. Ms. Colette van der Ven is founder and director of TULIP Consulting. Please, Colette. Thank you. Mr. Christian Spano is Circularity Director at Vale Base Metals. Christian? Thank you. Ms. Bryony Clearhill is Director of Innovation at ICMM, the International Council on Minerals and Metals. Welcome, Bryony. And last but not least, Professor Paul Ekins, who is a panel member of the International Resource Panel, but also the lead author of an upcoming report by the IRP on financing the responsible supply of energy transition minerals for sustainable development. I'll end with myself. I'm Djaheezah Subratty. I'm pleased to be moderating this event today. I'm the head of the consumption and production team at the UN Environment Programme, and I'm based in Paris, France, and working with a number of colleagues on sustainable consumption and production, as well as on circularity in a number of high-impact sectors. UNEP is also looking into issues relating to increasing resource efficiency, increasing circularity, responsible mining, as well as the whole equity dimension of critical energy transition minerals for sustainable development for all. Let me start with you, Colette. In your think tank, your consulting company, you've been working on circularity in the EU context, but also from multiple perspectives, from policy perspective, from the industry perspective. Janez just run us through a number of the Global Resource Outlook findings that talks to the absolute need to reduce the demand of materials so that we have sustainability and resilience across sectors. So from your own perspective and your experience, what do you think could be a good approach to making demand mitigation work for materials and to make it a reality, but mostly for high-income countries who at the moment are the ones consuming the most?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think that's really, when we talk about the circular economy, that's really at the heart of the problem that we're facing. And we did a report earlier, or last year, that was commissioned by OVAM, the Flanders Public Waste Agency, together with IEEP, where basically we looked exactly into that question of how the European Union can go to reducing material resource consumption. And basically how we got to looking into that question was, we've heard it from Janez earlier today, and other speakers as well, but the European Union is currently not on track in reducing material resource consumption. It's still consuming anywhere between 14 and 15 tons per capita, which is about twice the sustainable levels. And that, while there is an enormous amount of different regulations and initiatives that are being rolled out as part of the Circular Economy Action Plan. So something here is missing. And what is that missing piece? Now, that was basically the question of this report that we looked into. And what we basically advocated for doing the research about where are the current efforts going and where are they not going is the need to establish something beyond looking at downstream waste management initiatives or even the eco-design for sustainable products regulation towards something a little bit more overarching, so less fragmented, more binding. So we were advocating to establish an EU law on material resource consumption. And the motivation for that law, or what we used to frame or model this, was the EU climate law, which has been really instrumental in making net zero by 2055 a overarching legally binding objective that informs so much of the EU policy. So why can't we do something similar, but then for resource consumption reduction? And the report talks a little bit more about what that law would look like. It goes into quite a bit of detail about different considerations, challenges, opportunities. But the overarching point is that there needs to be a legally binding headline target that establishes to what level the EU must go in terms of consumption. An overarching one, intermediary ones, but also sector-specific ones. Janez talked about the 4 or 5 main sectors that are highly intensive with regards to material consumption, food, energy, build, transport. There should be specific targets for those. And then, of course, we looked at different instruments that EU member states can apply to get there, including a requirement to have a circular economy action plan focused on overall consumption reduction, and then laying out some of the other accompanying measures, indicators, what can be used, etc. So this is what we were advocating for in order to actually tackle what is driving so much of the excessive material use. And as Janez was also saying, recycling isn't going to cut it if consumption keeps increasing. So that's really the crux of that story. And related to that also, what we heard earlier, the Dutch minister say, is that there needs to be something more overarching so that countries can take serious action as opposed to feeling they're doing this by themselves. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colette. And you've led us into thinking that beyond governments and policy making, there's an absolutely essential role for industry in this equation. This landscape is a partnership between public policymakers and industry, who are actually at the forefront of a number of innovation and innovative thinking. Christian, coming from a base metal company that has been looking at how it can remain relevant and innovate and be at the forefront of transformation, often when we think of the mining industry, we think it's very linear, it's extracting. Do you think that there's a case, a business case, for mining as an industry to be circular? And what would it take for that to happen?
Thank you so much for the question. It's quite a fundamental question, and I think not only for the mining industry, but for the economy as a whole. No, everything is linear and has been designed as linear for a very long time. Let me tell you a little bit about Vale very quickly, because Vale is the core company that focuses on exploration and production of iron ore primarily. Vale Base Metals has been carved out very recently to create a company that is solely focused on the materials that are needed for the energy transition. We think of ourselves as a material solutions provider, as an energy transition material solutions provider. And that hints into your question in the sense of, how can we put principles of circularity to drive a mining company to be different and to still play a role, a substantial role in the future. There are a couple of things here that I think are important to raise. We will need, and this is something that Janez was presenting, we will need a lot of more metals in the future for basic needs and natural and the transition for the energy transition. We need to work and prioritize exactly how the presentation was going. We need to think about first how we optimize. There is a significant gap between supply and demand today. And so the question of optimizing the system should be a priority. It is likely that we still will need supply from these metals and minerals in the future. And the first thing that I invite you all to think about here is to go back to that very initial framework from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which has the biosphere on one side and how to become circular on the biosphere, and then the urban side, if you want to call it, on the right-hand side, and all the things that you can do. Recycling is one of the levers that they mention on the urban side. The reason is that on that urban side, you have durables. And one thing we need to really capture here is that minerals and metals are the most durable materials you can have. They are perfect to be recovered forever. They can build stocks. And how we design those stocks for easy recovery over time is part of the key answer here. On the bio side, the process of mining can be regenerative. It's not always, by no means. I don't want people to take away that I'm saying that it always is, on contrary, but it can be. We don't have to break the laws of physics to make it regenerative. And so what we want to do at Vale is to think about the process of supplying these energy transition minerals in a way that is increasingly responding to the needs of the biosphere by being regenerative. We're already building some partnerships that I can share later with you on that front. But at the same time, we need to escape the trap of only recycling as the process. From today, we need to build stocks of metals and minerals, because they are going to be the mineral resources or mines of the future, where we design for easy recovery, we know what those metals are, and we can access them forever. And so I completely agree with this vision that recycling is the entry point. We need to substantially improve it. There are hundreds of ways that we need to become better on that, but we need to go way beyond just recycling. So to answer your question in short, we are thinking about it. We not only think it's possible, but it's better, it's a better future, and we're actively working on it.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I think what you mentioned takes us back to, I think, the fundamental principles is that we have a climate crisis. We have terrible climate impacts that are happening, and the energy transition is essential and has to happen now at scale and with speed. So that's a given. And to be able to address that energy transition, we need critical energy transition minerals. So those transition minerals are essential for that energy transition to happen. What we need, however, is a way to make that happen that does not make us redo the mistakes that we've done as a planet, as a society, with the energy systems that we've had until now. And Bryony, I'm going to come to you now. So at ICMM, you've been looking into ESG principles and how, as an industry sector, circularity is something very important that needs to be looked into to be able to make those transition materials, those resources, last over time, be used in a smart way, not be wasted. Can you tell us a bit about some of the thinking that ICMM is having at the moment across the mining industry on how to really meaningfully enhance circularity and circular economy across the value chain? So not just at the extraction and the mining sites, but really across the value chain, because all of that we're talking about, the transition minerals, they're extracted, but they feed into value chains. And it's the value chain that we would like to see become more circular.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. So I'm going to build on what Christian's been sharing and a little bit about our journey. And for those of you who don't know, Christian worked at ICMM until recently, so it's very much our kind of joint work on this over the last few years. And so a couple of years ago when we started thinking about the circular economy, it was hard to see how mining would fit in. And you would have conversations, and I've actually had conversations here today where people have said, wow, it must be so difficult working in mining and being at a circular economy conference. I mean, yes and no. As an industry, we have a very, very difficult history, and we still don't get everything right. But as Christian said, the materials that we produce are absolutely fundamental to all of these planetary goals that we're trying to reach. So we know that we need more metals to build up our energy systems. We know that we need them to make sure that people have access to internet and electricity and all these basic needs. And so we went back to kind of the concept of the circular economy and tried to figure out how we could square this circle. And so we talk at ICMM and in the industry about two kind of circular concepts. So on the one side, we have what we describe as process circularity. And this is all the stuff that we can do through the mining process to bring in those circular principles. And there's so many examples that I could share with you. And we have a long way to go, but there is a lot happening in this space. And I'd also say that this isn't new. The mining industry is an industry that's always produced a huge amount of material in order to get quite a small amount of stuff. So if you're mining metals, you're having to dig up a huge amount of earth, and actually the metal you want is quite a small part of that. And so we've always been good at managing what you might call waste, but we're now trying to look at as kind of co-products, byproducts, and find other uses for those. And so a few examples of that. So Vale in Brazil are producing a sustainable sand as a co-product of iron ore mining. And this links really well to what Janez shared about the kind of non-metallic minerals being that huge portion of demand growth. If we can turn something that otherwise would be a waste of the iron ore industry into sand, that means that we're displacing the need to mine sand somewhere else. We're also at the moment seeing a lot of remining of tailings. So companies like Minsur in Peru, who are going back through something that in the past was considered waste, but now they know that they can extract tin because the technology's moved forward, it's advanced. We can go back through that and we can produce a valuable material from that. So on the process side, there's lots that's happening. But as you said, it's not just about mining. It's also about making sure that once we've got those metals out the ground, we're treating them as a valuable stock. We're not just letting them sit in a car and then become waste, or sit in an iPhone and then go in someone's drawer and then you don't see it for 10 years and then maybe eventually it just gets thrown in the bin. It's got to be about making sure that we're seeing that as a mine, which needs to be made available and kept in use. And so on this side, there's a lot of thinking going on, but it's not just the mining industry that can fix this. So there is stuff we can do. We have some companies who are already setting up their own e-waste processing facilities, tech resources in Canada who have a kind of circular economy for lead batteries and are putting secondary lead back through their smelters and getting a really high quality product. But this is where we also have to work with the value chain. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment with the car manufacturers, the tech companies, to understand the partnerships that can be created between the mining companies who have the expertise, the understanding of metals, they have the smelters, they have the infrastructure, with those companies further downstream who find they're closer to the consumer, so they're going to be able to more easily recover those materials and put them back into use.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bryony. And this actually leads us to you, Paul. The report that you're working on stresses the need for circular economy approaches, but also to look at the increase of secondary production of metals for the energy transition. From your perspective, what would be the levers that would be needed for circular economy to actually materialize in a commercial way? And what role would the finance sector have in this transformation? Looking at finance and investment is actually the focus of your think piece.
Well, thanks very much for the question. And yes, I have, over the last couple of years, been concentrating very much on these energy transition minerals, as we've come to call them. And the first thing I would say is that the overall circular economy levers around that set of materials is not very different to the kinds of circular economy ideas that we hear more broadly in the economy as a whole. So we start, as Janez started this morning, with material efficiency for the provision of needs and wants. And we can have a look at mobility, because the major use of these minerals is going to be in batteries for electric vehicles that will substitute for internal combustion engines. And immediately we can see what the material efficiency story around that is. And the first thing to say is that we're going in exactly the wrong direction, because the highest selling form of motor car in the UK at the moment is SUVs. SUVs use 2 to 3 times as much energy transition minerals in their batteries as a normal ICE car of 10 to 15 years ago, which weighed about half as much. So in that respect, consumers are going in precisely the wrong direction. Then we all know that one of the great stories in the world today is urbanization. And what kinds of cities are we living in and creating? Do we need motor cars to go around them, as you do predominantly in the United States, because the cities are so spread out? Or could we move to car-free urban environments, whereby you have a 15-minute city that you can walk, cycle in 15 minutes, or use public transport if you want to go further than that? And we all know, even in Europe, where our cities are much more concentrated, they're permanently clogged with cars. So those are 2 examples of material efficiency leading specifically into energy transition minerals, where we're not making any kind of progress at all, or we're going in precisely the wrong direction. Other circular economy levers obviously are to do with product life extension. We're talking about reuse, repair, refurbishment, remanufacture. We're talking about design for circularity, really important in this field. We're talking about product passports. We're talking about extended producer responsibility, perhaps moving into material ownership, whereby you don't sell materials, you sell services, and you retain responsibility for the materials because you know what they are, what to use. At the moment, with some exceptions, those kinds of circular levers are not economic. They're not financially viable. People who invest in them don't make money, or they find it extremely difficult to break out of very small and particular niches. So circular economy and energy transition materials is part of a much bigger story of needing to move towards a circular economy much more broadly. Then, obviously, recycling has a story to tell. And Christian was saying you can't recycle something until you've got a decent stock of it in the economy to start with, because there are economies of scale and it becomes completely uneconomic. And as Bryony said, for particularly these minerals, which the uses of which have only just fairly recently become transparent, they were regarded as wastes. And there are large concentrations of them, much greater concentrations than in many ores, sitting in tailings piles. How many tailings are there in the world today? Well, that was estimated quite recently as being 13 billion tons in all the tailings waste piles all around the planet. So that's quite a lot of material which we will need to revisit in order to find what we need. What's the role of the finance sector, which was your last question? Obviously, it's critical. All this stuff needs investment. And the one thing which I don't think we're going to change is that for the private sector to invest something, it needs a return. And if it's not happening, by and large, it's because it's not getting a return. Partly that's because we externalize social environmental costs, real costs, which are not picked up by the producers or the users, but by future generations or third parties down the line. And we need to internalize those costs. And then we get to these high social and environmental standards, which were at the top of Janez's list in the policy reforms advocated from GROW24. There will be a green premium to produce these metals to high social and environmental standards. And in today's commodity markets, where a ton of copper is a ton of copper is a ton of copper, obviously, if you're producing green copper and it's not commanding a green premium, you're not going to sell it in the standard market. So we need to move to these much more differentiated markets. And I'm enormously encouraged by the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, because it specifically says that the European Union will be moving towards mutually beneficial partnerships with producer countries so that those countries can produce to high social and environmental standards, which most of the mining companies that I come across would like to do, and they will be guaranteed a market in the countries that want to use those materials. That brings us right into trade, and trade is clearly critical here. And just as we have a carbon border adjustment mechanism to try to get a level playing field internationally in terms of carbon use, we are going to need the same sorts of trading arrangements that means that responsible and environmentally sound minerals are not driven out by their much worse counterparts. So there's an enormous systemic reform agenda here, which we've really just begun to scratch.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And this takes us to the fact that at the moment, this landscape where we need policy, pricing, market signals is just taking its baby steps. You know, it's not really anchored and mainstreamed, even though that word is probably not the best word. But things are happening and things are shifting. And in this context of what we used to consider to be waste, but actually are resources, but sitting idly there, and sitting as waste because the pricing and the valuing of those resources is not happening the way it should be. I'm coming back to you, Christian. So from the extractive industry, from Vale perspective, how do you see that secondary resource market emerging and growing? What future does it have? And we heard about tailings from Paul, and we know that tailings is a huge pile of resources sitting there to be tapped into, but it's not happening, again, because some of the price signals are not right.
Look, it's a great question because it takes us to a view that, there are up to $300 billion worth of copper only in copper tailings today. That's only copper, and up to 300 billion, depending on the grade, depending on how much copper you find in that. And there is a lot of copper in legacy tailings because of how the resource was processed in the past. So there are actually mines there. And on the urban side, the circular economy, which presented today at the beginning of the day, wrote a report in 2019, the GAP report in 2019, where they identified roughly $150 trillion worth of resources in all the infrastructure and products we have globally. Just to give you an example, the global GDP is 100 trillion. This is 1.5 times the global economy. And what we really need to be careful here is the distraction of recycling-only lens give us. We tend to say recycling is, today, low margins, scattered, it's not a very attractive business. And we need to wait 30, 40, 50 years to get the stocks created. We are creating today the new stocks. Today, and increasingly so, we're going to get vast amounts of very valuable minerals and metals into the urban stock. Now, are we going to lock it into infrastructure and products that are hard to recover? Or are we going to be smart and design all products, all infrastructure to be easy to recover at any point? Are we going to trace it? Are we going to value it? Are we going to stop calling it waste? Because if you tell me as a business that there are 2 new endowments, one urban endowment, and an additional site endowment, starting with tailings, but there is more than tailings. And we call it resources, and we're talking about trillions on one side and hundreds of billions on the other side. I'm super excited. More because it's super low in carbon, 80% lower in carbon, it's closer to the market, it gives local jobs, it regenerates the area that previously was mined. It's a win-win situation. But if we keep calling it waste, and we treat it as waste under the policy of waste, we're just creating barriers.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. Increasing resource use, increasing circularity, we will still, however, need to some extent to extract virgin resources, virgin materials. However, and the world is demanding that, and industry is moving in that direction increasingly, that mining has to be increasingly responsible and done in a manner and in a way that is good for business, but it's good for society and for economies. From ICMM perspective, Bryony, what is ICMM doing to ensure that critical energy transition minerals that are being supplied meet those ESG standards and criteria and aspire to the highest standards? If the ones that we have right now across the world are not enough, where do we need to go? How do we ensure that there's full transparency and accountability at extraction, but also with partners across the value chains?
Great, thanks for the question. So Yeah, we know that we need to keep mining to some degree because recycling, recovering those secondary materials isn't going to fill the gap. And so the key thing, and this comes through really strongly in the GROW report, is that we have to be making sure that anything entering the system is doing so with the right ESG credentials. And in my mind, there's two aspects to that. So one part of it is about transparency, and it's about ESG standards, and it's about making sure that we're demonstrating performance. The other part is about raising performance and trying to lift up the whole industry. And so taking those two in turn, so at ICMM, we bring together about a third of the global mining industry to work collectively on kind of issues related to sustainable development. And as part of that, our members have to follow our standard for responsible mining, which we call the mining principles. Anyone who knows the mining industry will know that this is a really complicated landscape and that there are multiple different standards out there, all of which basically say the same thing. But they've emerged for different reasons. They've got slightly different governance processes, different focuses. And so a lot of effort at ICMM at the moment is going into a big process together with the Mining Association of Canada, the World Gold Council, and the Copper Mark to try to develop a consolidated standard for responsible mining. And so through that process, what we're trying to do is streamline and simplify the landscape so that there is kind of one source of the truth, and there is this standard which will be implemented at sites around the world. It will have multi-stakeholder governance, and it'll have an assurance process associated with it. And so that's really important in an industry where we have these really complicated supply chains. So you might not know as the downstream exactly who it is you're buying from, but these standards can help you kind of figure out through the supply chain what's happening at that mine site and bring some level of transparency. So that process is underway, and there'll be public consultation later in the year. And if this is a space where you're involved anywhere through our value chain, I'd really encourage you to get involved in that public consultation so that we can hopefully build a standard that will bring a lot of accountability and transparency to the value chain. The other approach that we have to take is actually improving performance. So not just showing how we're doing, but actually working to do better. And that's really the bread and butter of what we do at ICMM. So we try to find those issues where collective work can do more than one company could on its own. So there's loads of different examples of that I could talk about, but I guess specifically on circular economy, two pieces of work that I would kind of highlight would be some research that we did last year with the Enel Foundation. So as a renewables company, they're kind of part of our value chain. They're both a supplier to the mining industry, but also a purchaser. And so we worked with them and Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment to develop a piece of research looking at the enablers for the circular economy within this industry. And specifically, it came out with a set of recommendations for the leadership of mining companies on how they can take further action on circular economy. And so that's a piece of work that ICMM has kind of done and put out into the world to hopefully help lift the whole industry. And then this year, we're working with Circle Economy to take that work further and actually start to understand a baseline of current performance across the industry. And so that will be coming out later in the year. And that'll be, again, a really exciting piece that hopefully will kind of give us the roadmap for how to do better on circular economy and how we can kind of put some of these recommendations into action. So for me, it's those two parts. Part of it is about the transparency, but also you just have to do better. And that's where an organization like ICMM and our partners can hopefully help to kind of raise a big section of the industry and improve performance.
Thanks so much, Bryony. Paul, I'm going to come back to you. You've been talking about the role of finance for the energy transition. What would be financial system innovation or changes that would be absolutely essential for that transition to happen and to be scaled up?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are two answers to that question. The most fundamental is that circularity and sustainability have got to become profitable. It's as simple as that. If they're profitable, the finance sector will invest in them because that's what it does. They're not profitable at the moment because far too many of these costs are externalized, and politicians find it really difficult to introduce the regulations and the taxes that will be necessary to internalize these costs. So that's the mainstream finance industry. Before we get there, and I've been working on these issues much too long. I would have hoped we would have got there rather sooner than we currently have. There is a move towards sustainable finance, towards a small part of the financial sector, but one that is growing, that is prepared to still demand a financial return, but not to maximize the financial return, that is prepared to accept sustainable development returns, that is prepared to accept environmental returns and social returns as part of their return, and in some senses ask for a lower financial return. And there are investors who are prepared to go into that. And it's been very interesting watching that sector grow from, in the 1990s, something absolutely minuscule to now something that is still niche, still small, but is numbered in the trillions rather than in the tens of millions. So let's put it like that. That needs to grow, and that needs to be encouraged by things like the EU and other international taxonomies, which the gentleman from the European Investment Bank talked about this morning. Mining is nowhere in the taxonomy in the EU at the moment. It's simply not mentioned. It's kind of thought of as a brown industry, which is something that, you know, we kind of need, but we're going to hold our noses while we do it. Whereas actually, mining has to be part of this solution for the energy transition. It has enormous potential for development in the resource-rich parts of the world if it is done properly. And you're hearing from Bryony that a large section of the industry wants to do it properly if it can be profitable. And if it can't be profitable, obviously these companies will go out of business. So that's the circle that we need to square through public policy. And public policy and the politicians have got to be absolutely centrally involved in that and persuade their publics that the green premium is worth paying. And indeed, it is essential that it is paid if we are to have either the energy transition or indeed any kind of sustainable future.
Thank you. And it's very true that this is a shared responsibility between public policymakers, industry, but also consumers. This transformation will not happen unless everyone is on board and willing to make compromises, you know, for things have to change, but they cannot change if we want a status quo of the way we are living at the moment. Turning back to you, Colette, we've heard from Bryony, from Christian, and from Paul on a number of the both upstream and downstream measures, but mostly going back to what Janez mentioned from the Global Resource Outlook on the absolute need to have demand mitigation. So demand has to go down for the sector to be more sustainable, but also resilient over time. We know that supply disruptions can make the energy transition stall and not deliver on the promise that it has. So, but we do know that materials, not all, even those country-rich materials, they do not have all of them. So at the end of the day, there's trade. Materials need to move from one jurisdiction to another, they get extracted, they get transformed. What would be, from your perspective, some practical steps for governments in high-income countries, as currently big consumers, to set the right policy and legal framework for that to happen, so that there's an element of compliance in the equation? And how do you see trade? You've worked a lot on trade aspects. How do you see trade as an enabler of that transformation?
Yeah, thank you very much. So with regards to the first part of the question, how can we put back in the equation, well, we've got the increase in critical minerals that we also saw on the slides of Janez. We've got the sustainability objectives and how they're sourced. And then also we've got the objective of wanting to reduce consumption. And how does all of that fit together. I think I'm going to turn back to what I started with, which is the need for an overarching regulatory framework that focuses on actually reducing aggregate demand, absolute demand for some of these materials. That needs to be driving the bus, and I think that links to the end of Janez's presentation, where he said the logic needs to be flipped. We first have to see where we can build systems that are less resource intensive, so we're not as dependent on as many materials and minerals as we are now. And then that should be driving the bus to then inform from those minerals and materials we still need, how will we do so consecutively. So I think there is a need for different levels of regulatory frameworks, starting with this overarching approach and then going more granularly. If there is this overarching approach, it will also create more regulatory coherence. The Critical Raw Materials Act was mentioned, and the Critical Raw Materials Act seeks to ensure that a resource-poor place like the EU has secure access to the minerals and metals it needs in order to reach the EU Green Deal's ambitions, which of course is one of the key objectives of the green agenda. But as we've seen, that goes hand in hand with the extraction of these metals and materials and everything, the human rights side, the sustainability side, etc., that comes with that. But there is a need to collectively approach this. So it's not just the Critical Raw Materials Act here that wants to get the stuff, and then there is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation that looks at more or better designed products, and then we have, say, the packaging and waste regulation. They need to be connected through this overarching approach, and that is what's currently missing, at least in the context of the EU. So that's the first part. On the trade dimension, you're right, trade is something that I work on a lot. I think in the context of the circular economy and critical raw materials, it's really quite complex because right now what we see is that the EU has essentially employed different instruments to securing access to these raw material value chains. One of them is through free trade agreements. Right now in free trade agreements that are being negotiated, there are chapters on energy and raw materials that are included. And those chapters essentially seek to ensure that EU investors have more secure access to critical raw material value chains, and that, for instance, pricing is done in accordance with market principles like prohibitions on dual pricing, domestically regulated pricing, monopolies, things like that. And very interestingly, what you see is that there is an overarching emphasis on wanting to secure those materials, and at the same time, sustainable securing of materials, or more general sustainability and human rights principles, they're taking a back seat. So they're either hortatory in language, non-enforceable, or the obligation is just very vague. So you see that the balance right now between those different objectives is not struck, at least not within the context of FTAs. There's another element to this, which are sustainable partnership agreements. There, the language, and this was mentioned as well, the language is a lot more inclusive. It's a lot more about value addition within the sourcing country, technology transfer, financing, etc., human rights, sustainability. But where there is a weakness is that those are non-enforceable memoranda of understanding. And it doesn't set out in enough detail how all of these benefits are going to occur. So a lot of work is yet to be done in better linking these different elements that have come out of the EU Green Deal to ensure a sustainable future.
Thank you very much, Colette. We are already beyond time, but I'm going to take a couple of questions that came from the audience. One may be going to you, Paul. What would it take to build an empowered world overarching body to drive circular economy, including for transition minerals? We just heard from Colette that the landscape is skewed and maybe there's a need for a better balance. I'm not sure about an overarching body, but that's the question. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, what we know is that setting up new international institutions is difficult, and normally it requires a crisis to do it. I think of the International Energy Agency, of course, set up in the 1970s around the time of the energy crises that hit there. And I now, from today's perspective, look back and think, was that a good thing to do? And we can't even imagine the world without the International Energy Agency, to be honest. It provides so much insight and knowledge about energy, and it's the International Energy Agency that is now having to tiptoe into the whole energy transition mineral space because there's no one else to do it. So one of the things which I would very much like to see is an international minerals and metals agency performing very much the same kind of function as the International Energy Agency does for energy, because these minerals are going to be absolutely critical, and having an international overview of the sustainable development outcomes in those countries that are producing them and the way in which other countries that are using them are moving towards circularity in their use of them would be absolutely invaluable. And we could share best practice. We would become aware of a whole heap of stuff that we're not aware of at the moment. It could hold the global tailings database. It could do an enormous number of things. And I confidently expect that in 20 years' time, if we were to set it up today, we wouldn't know how we managed without it up until now. So there's just one example of an overarching body which I think the world is currently missing very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. One final question, and this one is under the transparency of value chains. And Bryony, you've been, speaking quite a bit to that point. So how can we make value chains more transparent? And we have a lot with digitalization, blockchain.
That is a
Where should we be going? AI?
It's a huge question, and I wish I had the answer to it. Let me try. I mean, I think there's a few different things happening in this space. So I think standards in the processing part are a good starting place. So making sure, firstly, that we're producing the materials in the right way, and we've got that transparency down to the individual mine site of how that material is being produced. The challenge then comes with where that data goes and how traceable it is through the value chain. So there is some really interesting work happening in a few different places around kind of chain of custody standards. So trying to pass that information through. At the moment, it's quite commodity specific. So the copper mark has a system, and there's a different system in aluminium. And so that is a challenge at the moment, that it kind of sits quite commodity specific. There's also loads of really interesting work happening around blockchain and for kind of traceability. But again, it's a really fragmented landscape. And so I think at the moment we're in that difficult spot where there's loads of great ideas and people are going and setting them up, but there's 100 different ideas all being set up simultaneously. And so we've got an incredibly fragmented landscape. So I hope that we're kind of moving towards potentially some kind of consolidation, but it's a difficult one for sure. There's a lot of good ideas there, but yeah, we don't, I think, have a kind of single solution at the moment.
Christian.
Very quickly before, I see these red numbers pumping and I get nervous. I was thinking, if people should leave the room, with a message, what would it be? And I would use 3 words. This is exciting. We're talking a lot about the constraints, how difficult it is, how we don't have the conditions, how much work it is. All of that is true. But if people need to live with 3 words, this is exciting. Because we're moving from a fossil economy to a renewable economy. We do have the materials. Circularity is a fantastic opportunity, both in the materials that we have on site and the urban environment. This is very exciting. We need to set the conditions to make it profitable, to make it the mainstream, to make it large scale. But you shouldn't leave the room thinking, we are stuck. It's difficult, but it's exciting.
And absolutely needed, and it has to happen, and now. So with this, thank you very much for having joined us and for having actively participated in this debate. This is just one of many, and we hope to see you in other fora to carry forward this conversation. So join me in thanking our panelists, Paul, Christian, Bryony, and Colette today. Thank you.